Some people spend their whole lives fearing the monster under the bed, never realizing the real danger is the smile that tucks them in at night. Evelyn Carter had trusted that smile for 23 years. The crystal goblet her older sister Charlotte handed her sparkled beneath the golden chandeliers of Carter Manor, catching the warm glow of hundreds of candles prepared for the moon harvest banquet. Music drifted through the grand ballroom, while nobles laughed over polished glasses filled with deep crimson wine. Charlotte's expression looked softer than Evelyn had seen in years. "Drink," she whispered with surprising warmth. "Tonight, everything will finally change for you." Evelyn hesitated only for a heartbeat before lifting the glass. She had spent most of her life believing kindness could still bloom inside wounded hearts. Maybe this was the night her sister had finally forgiven old jealousies neither of them spoke aloud. The first sip tasted sweet with hints of blackberry and honey. The second carried a strange bitterness she couldn't quite place. By the time the orchestra began another graceful melody, the room had already started to blur around the edges. Faces stretched into shadows. Candlelight shimmered like stars falling into water. Her breathing slowed as the marble floor seemed to drift beneath her shoes. She tried to steady herself against a carved pillar, but her fingers refused to obey. Somewhere across the ballroom, Charlotte's gentle smile never moved. Instead, it quietly widened. Voices became distant echoes. Someone caught Evelyn before she collapsed completely. She tried to ask what was happening, but no words escaped her lips. Darkness folded over her thoughts as though the entire world had been wrapped inside a velvet curtain. Hours later, silence woke her first. Not voices, not music, silence. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open beneath unfamiliar silk curtains swaying gently beside towering windows. Pale moonlight spilled across an enormous chamber unlike anything she had ever seen. Every piece of furniture carried the unmistakable elegance reserved for royal chambers. Her heartbeat stumbled. She sat upright too quickly, clutching the blanket around herself as confusion washed through her. Her gown remained exactly as she remembered. Her shoes rested neatly beside the bed. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet none of that eased the panic rising inside her chest. She recognized the room from whispered stories every child in the Northern Territories had grown up hearing. This was the private chamber of Alpha King Lucian Blackwood. Terror tightened her throat. Why was she here? The heavy oak door slowly opened. Evelyn froze as a tall figure stepped quietly into the room. His dark coat reflected faint silver beneath the moonlight, and his calm gray eyes settled on her without anger, surprise, or triumph. The Alpha King closed the door behind him with measured care, remaining several feet away as though protecting an invisible boundary. His steady voice broke the silence. "You're awake." Evelyn scrambled backward against the carved headboard, her breathing uneven. "Your Majesty, I don't know how I got here." Lucian studied her trembling expression for a long moment before answering. "I know." Outside the chamber, unseen footsteps hurried down endless palace corridors. Somewhere beyond those stone walls, someone was already preparing a story that would destroy her life before sunrise. Lucian remained where he stood, leaving several feet between them as though the distance itself carried meaning. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable authority in the quiet stillness that surrounded him. Evelyn's pulse refused to slow. Every frightening story she had ever heard about the Alpha King echoed through her thoughts, but none of those stories matched the man standing before her now. His expression held neither anger nor amusement. Instead, he watched her with careful restraint, as if making certain she felt no additional fear. "You are safe here," he said calmly. "No one has entered this room except me." Evelyn lowered her eyes, trying to understand the impossible situation. "I remember the banquet. Charlotte gave me a drink. After that, everything disappeared." Lucian nodded once, his silver eyes never leaving her face. "That confirms what I suspected." Confusion slowly replaced panic. "You knew something was wrong?" He walked toward the fireplace instead of the bed, pouring a glass of fresh water before placing it on a nearby table within her reach. Even then, he stepped back again. "When my guards informed me that an unconscious guest had been placed inside my private chamber, I knew someone wanted a witness to discover us together before sunrise." Evelyn stared at him. "Someone planned this?" His answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Her hands tightened around the blanket as shame threatened to overwhelm her. She could already imagine servants whispering in hallways, nobles exchanging knowing smiles, strangers deciding her character without ever hearing her voice. "Everyone will believe the worst," she whispered. Lucien's gaze hardened, though not toward her. Many people choose the easiest story instead of the truthful one. Silence settled between them for several long moments. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the tall windows, washing silver streaks across the moonlit glass. Evelyn finally looked toward him again. "Why did you stay?" she asked quietly. "You could have left." A faint shadow crossed his features before he answered. "Because if I had walked away, someone else might have entered this room before you woke." His words landed gently, carrying no pride, only simple honesty. "So I remained until you could speak for yourself." Evelyn felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Nobody had protected her simply because it was the right thing to do. Not since her mother had passed away years before. Lucien glanced toward the closed door as though listening for something beyond the walls. "At dawn," he said, "this palace will become louder than any battlefield." She frowned. "How can you know that?" Before he could answer, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Several voices rose in urgent whispers before disappearing again. Lucien exhaled slowly, almost as though the moment he had expected had finally arrived. He looked back at Evelyn with steady resolve. "Because whoever placed you here never intended this night to remain a secret. They intended an audience." Evelyn's heartbeat quickened once more. Somewhere beyond the heavy doors, the first rumors had already begun their journey through the palace, growing larger with every person who repeated them, while the truth remained trapped inside a single silent room. The first rays of morning sunlight had barely reached the palace windows when the silence outside shattered into hurried footsteps and anxious whispers. Evelyn stood frozen beside the bed, every instinct urging her to disappear before anyone saw her, but there was nowhere to run. Lucien remained composed, adjusting the cuff of his dark coat as though preparing for an ordinary meeting instead of the storm gathering beyond the chamber walls. A loud knock echoed through the room before the heavy doors swung open without waiting for permission. Palace officials entered first, followed by several noble women whose expressions were already filled with judgment. Charlotte stood among them, perfectly dressed in pale blue silk, one trembling hand pressed dramatically against her chest. The instant her eyes found Evelyn, tears appeared so quickly they looked rehearsed. "There she is," Charlotte whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I prayed all night that my sister would be safe." Gasps spread across the room. Every gaze settled upon Evelyn, searching for proof of stories that had already traveled through the palace before dawn. She felt their questions without anyone speaking them aloud. Why had she been inside the Alpha King's private chamber? What had she done to earn such forbidden access? Why had the king allowed it? Evelyn opened her mouth, but fear stole every word before they could escape. Charlotte took a careful step forward, lowering her eyes with convincing sorrow. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "if my sister has made an unforgivable mistake, our family accepts full responsibility." Evelyn stared at her in disbelief. It sounded compassionate, yet every word quietly confirmed an accusation that had never been spoken. Lucien finally moved. He crossed the room with slow, measured steps until he stood beside Evelyn instead of across from her. The simple gesture caused several nobles to exchange uncertain glances. His calm voice filled the chamber without rising above conversation. No mistake occurred here. The room became perfectly still. Charlotte blinked. "Your Majesty?" Lucien looked directly at every witness before speaking again. "Miss Evelyn Carter arrived unconscious. She has remained unharmed from the moment she entered this room until the moment each of you walked through that door." Silence stretched across the chamber like a drawn curtain. Evelyn saw confusion replace confidence on several faces. Charlotte's smile disappeared for only a heartbeat before she quickly recovered. "Perhaps my sister simply does not remember," she suggested gently. Lucien's silver eyes settled upon her with quiet intensity. "Memory is not required when facts are present." He turned toward the captain of the royal guard, standing near the entrance. "State what you witnessed." The captain stepped forward immediately. "Your Majesty ordered every servant to leave the chamber. No one entered during the night. I remained outside the door with 4 guards until sunrise." Murmurs swept through the room. The story everyone had expected suddenly began to fracture. Evelyn lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by relief she had not dared hope for. Yet something inside Lucien's expression told her this was only the beginning. Someone had arranged every detail with remarkable precision, believing shame alone would accomplish their goal. As the nobles slowly retreated into uncertain whispers, Lucien watched Charlotte without revealing a single accusation. She lowered her gaze politely, but for the briefest instant, Evelyn caught something hidden beneath her sister's graceful mask. It was not fear. It was frustration, as though the first move in a carefully planned game had failed, and another was already waiting. By noon, the palace no longer sounded like the seat of a kingdom. It sounded like a marketplace filled with stories that changed every time they were repeated. Servants lowered their voices whenever Evelyn passed, yet their curious eyes followed her through every marble hallway. Some believed the Alpha King had shown extraordinary mercy. Others insisted he had hidden a secret that could never be spoken aloud. A few claimed the entire event had been carefully staged from the beginning. Every version carried the same ending. Evelyn's name stood at the center of it. She walked through the eastern garden with her hands folded tightly before her, hoping the quiet rustle of autumn leaves would drown out the whispers that seemed to follow wherever she went. The palace roses had begun to bloom beneath the cool mountain air, their fragrance gentle enough to remind her of mornings long before life became so complicated. She wished, even for a moment, that she could disappear among them. "Miss Carter." She turned at the familiar voice. Lucien approached without guards or royal attendants, dressed simply in a charcoal coat that made him appear less like a ruler and more like a man carrying responsibilities too heavy for one person alone. He stopped several feet away, maintaining the same respectful distance he had shown since the previous night. "I hope the palace has treated you kindly today," he said. Evelyn offered a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "The palace has been polite. The rumors have not." Lucien looked toward the stone fountain, where several noble guests quickly pretended not to watch them. "Rumors survive because people repeat them without asking who benefits." His words lingered in her thoughts. "Do you believe someone benefits from this?" she asked quietly. "I do not believe it." His calm expression never changed. "I know it." Evelyn searched his face, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Then you already know who did this." "Not yet." He glanced briefly toward the grand balcony overlooking the gardens. "But every lie leaves footprints. The person who planned this expected emotion to hide those tracks. I prefer evidence." Unknown to Evelyn, two trusted members of the royal guard had already begun quietly questioning palace servants. They discovered that the guest list for the banquet had been altered only hours before the celebration. A serving maid remembered Charlotte insisting on personally delivering wine to her younger sister. Another attendant recalled seeing an unfamiliar palace messenger escorting an unconscious guest through a private corridor usually reserved for royal staff. Individually, each detail meant little. Together, they formed the outline of something carefully arranged. Meanwhile, Charlotte welcomed concerned nobles into the Carter family's private sitting room with graceful composure. She sighed at exactly the right moments, expressed endless concern for Evelyn's reputation, and gently suggested that the stress of recent events might have clouded her sister's memory. Every sentence sounded compassionate, yet each one quietly encouraged doubt. By evening, the kingdom seemed divided between sympathy and suspicion. Evelyn remained unaware that invisible lines were already being drawn around everyone involved. As the sun slipped behind the distant mountains, Lucien stood alone inside his study examining a handwritten seating chart from the banquet. One name had been crossed out and replaced only hours before the celebration began. His fingers rested on the fresh ink for a long moment before he looked toward the darkening window. Very softly, almost to himself, he said, "Someone wanted her in my room. The only question left is why." The following morning arrived wrapped in cool mountain mist, but the uneasiness inside the palace had only grown heavier. Evelyn found herself wandering into the royal library, the one place where whispers seemed to fade beneath towering shelves filled with centuries of forgotten histories. She had always believed books were kinder than people because they never judged the hands that opened them. She traced her fingertips lightly across worn leather bindings, trying to quiet the questions that refused to leave her mind. Had her entire life truly led to one carefully planned betrayal? The soft creak of the library door interrupted her thoughts. Lucien stepped inside carrying a small bundle of parchment tied with a dark ribbon. He noticed her immediately, but did not disturb the silence. Instead, he walked toward a nearby table and carefully placed the documents down before looking at her with the same calm respect he had shown since the night everything changed. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. Evelyn managed a faint smile. "No one ever comes here." His eyes drifted across the endless shelves. "That tells me they are missing one of the finest rooms in the palace." For the first time in days, a quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound surprised both of them. It was small, almost fragile, but genuine. Lucien seemed relieved to hear it. "One of the librarians told me you used to spend afternoons reading when you were a child," he said. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "My mother brought me here before she passed away. She said books could teach courage long before life demanded it." The warmth in her voice faded almost instantly. After she was gone, Charlotte became the daughter everyone admired. She was confident, beautiful, charming. "I was simply convenient." Lucien remained silent, allowing her words to settle instead of rushing to answer. She slowly continued. "Whenever something went wrong, I apologized, even when I had done nothing. It was easier than arguing. Eventually, I forgot there was a difference." Those words lingered in the quiet library far longer than either of them expected. Lucien finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "That is not kindness." Evelyn looked at him. "No." He shook his head gently. "Kindness is freely given. What you describe is surviving." She stared at him without speaking. No one had ever separated those two things before. Across the palace, the royal investigators continued following every small clue. They quietly questioned stable hands, kitchen servants, musicians, and guards who had worked during the banquet. Piece by piece, a clearer picture began to emerge. Charlotte had changed seating arrangements only hours before dinner. She had dismissed Evelyn's usual maid and insisted another servant assist her instead. A palace messenger who claimed to be acting under special instructions had conveniently disappeared before sunrise. None of it proved guilt, but together the details no longer resembled coincidence. As evening approached, Lucien untied the ribbon around the stack of parchment resting on the table. Inside were copies of guest lists, servant assignments, and hallway watch records. He studied them for a long moment, before one detail caught his attention. A signature approving the last-minute changes matched neither the royal steward nor any palace official. Someone had forged authorization using elegant handwriting that looked almost perfect. Lucien's steady gaze lifted toward the window where the fading sunlight painted the sky gold. Very quietly, he whispered, "This was never only about humiliating Evelyn. Someone expected the crown itself to believe the lie." The answer revealed itself just before sunset, not through a confession, but through a forgotten ledger hidden inside the palace archives. Lucien stood beside the long oak table, while Captain Rowan carefully unfolded several aging documents collected from the banquet staff. Every page seemed ordinary until one small detail connected them all. A payment had been made 3 days before the celebration to an outside courier using funds withdrawn from an account belonging to Lord Victor Ashcombe, one of the wealthiest noblemen in the Northern Territories and an ambitious member of the Royal Council. The courier's description matched the mysterious messenger who had escorted Evelyn through the private corridor on the night of the banquet. Lucien studied the names without speaking. "Lord Ashcombe has never attended a Carter family gathering," Rowan said quietly. "There should have been no reason for his servants to interfere." Lucien's eyes narrowed slightly. Unless the banquet was never the true destination. At that same moment, Evelyn sat alone inside the palace conservatory, surrounded by blooming white orchids. Their delicate fragrance reminded her of peaceful afternoons with her mother, long before every family dinner had become a careful performance. She replayed every memory of Charlotte's unusual kindness on the night of the banquet. The warm smile, the generous words, the insistence that Evelyn drink the wine before greeting the guests. Looking back, every gesture now carried a different meaning. She closed her eyes, struggling to understand how someone she had loved all her life could patiently arrange such betrayal. Meanwhile, Charlotte welcomed Lord Ashcombe into a private drawing room inside the Carter residence. Neither realized that one of the royal attendants assigned to serve tea had quietly been placed there by Lucien's investigators. Charlotte paced beside the fireplace, unable to hide her frustration. Everything was supposed to be finished by now, she whispered. Lord Ashcombe remained composed. One unexpected decision from the king does not destroy the plan. Charlotte folded her arms tightly. He was supposed to accept what everyone believed. Instead, he defended her. The older nobleman smiled with unsettling confidence. Then we simply continue. Public doubt is slower than certainty, but it is often stronger. Charlotte stopped pacing. What if he discovers our connection? Lord Ashcombe shook his head. He cannot prove intent. Without intent, there is only coincidence. Neither of them noticed the servant quietly leaving the room with a tray that suddenly seemed much lighter than before. Less than an hour later, Captain Rowan placed a written report before Lucien. The conversation had been carefully recorded exactly as it was spoken. Lucien read every line twice. The final pieces finally settled into place. This had never been about destroying Evelyn's reputation alone. Her humiliation had simply been the doorway. If the kingdom believed the Alpha King had secretly compromised an innocent noblewoman, political pressure would have demanded a formal alliance to restore public confidence. Lord Ashcombe had intended to control that alliance through Charlotte, strengthening his influence over the throne itself. Evelyn had never been the prize. She had been the sacrifice chosen to move powerful people across a much larger board. Lucien slowly folded the report and looked toward the palace courtyard where evening shadows stretched across the stone paths. His voice remained calm, but his decision carried the certainty of sunrise. Tomorrow, the council will gather. They believe they are coming to discuss a scandal. Instead, they will witness the truth. The royal council assembled beneath the towering glass dome just after sunrise, where pale light poured across polished marble and banners bearing the crest of the Northern Territories hung in perfect silence. Every influential family had answered the Alpha King's summons. Noblemen exchanged careful greetings while noblewomen whispered behind folded fans, each convinced the meeting would settle the scandal that had consumed the kingdom for days. Evelyn stood near the back of the great hall beside Captain Rowan, wishing she could disappear into the towering stone columns. Charlotte entered moments later dressed in elegant ivory, her posture graceful and composed, while Lord Victor Ashcombe walked confidently at her side. Neither of them looked worried. They believed the uncertainty surrounding the banquet still protected them. When Lucien finally entered the chamber, every conversation stopped at once. He crossed the hall with measured confidence before taking his place beneath the royal crest. His silver eyes swept across the gathering without haste. "Thank you for attending," he began calmly. "Several days ago, false rumors spread through this palace. Today, those rumors end." A servant stepped forward carrying a carved wooden chest sealed with the royal emblem. Lucien nodded once, and Captain Rowan carefully opened it before placing several documents upon the council table. These records include banquet assignments, forged authorizations, payment ledgers, and witness statements collected during the investigation. Quiet murmurs spread through the chamber. Lord Ashcombe folded his hands as though completely unconcerned. Charlotte lowered her eyes with practiced innocence. Lucien continued without changing his tone. "One signature authorized the movement of Miss Evelyn Carter into my private chamber. It appeared genuine until royal archivists compared it with official palace records. Another document was placed beside the first. Even from across the hall, the differences became unmistakable. The forged handwriting had copied every elegant curve except one distinctive flourish hidden within the official signature." Several council members leaned closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief. Lucien turned toward Captain Rowan. "Please continue." Rowan unfolded another parchment. "A courier received payment from an account belonging to Lord Victor Ashcombe 3 days before the banquet. Multiple witnesses confirmed the courier escorted Miss Carter through a restricted palace corridor using forged authorization." Lord Ashcombe finally stepped forward. "Circumstantial evidence," he replied evenly. "Nothing more." Lucien gave a slight nod. "That would have been true yesterday." Rowan produced one final report. A royal attendant overheard a private conversation between Lord Ashcombe and Miss Charlotte Carter. Their discussion confirmed that the incident was intended to pressure the crown through public scandal. Complete silence settled over the chamber. Charlotte's confident expression finally broke. She looked toward Lord Ashcombe, searching for reassurance that never came. Evelyn could hardly breathe. Every painful accusation she had silently carried was unraveling before her eyes. Lucien looked directly at Charlotte, not with anger, but with unmistakable disappointment. You believed the truth could be buried beneath enough whispers. Instead, every whisper led back to you. Charlotte's shoulders trembled. For the first time since the banquet, her carefully crafted composure disappeared. She tried to speak, but no explanation came. The council members slowly lowered their heads, realizing they had nearly condemned an innocent woman simply because the lie had sounded believable. Evelyn remained motionless, overwhelmed not by triumph, but by sadness. She looked at the sister she had admired as a little girl and struggled to recognize the stranger standing before her. Then, to the surprise of everyone present, Evelyn quietly stepped forward. Her voice remained gentle despite everything she had endured. "Your Majesty," she said, "I only ask that justice leave room for mercy." The request echoed through the silent hall, and every eye turned toward Lucien, waiting to see how a king would answer a woman whose kindness had survived even betrayal. The council chamber emptied slowly, leaving behind only echoes of quiet conversations and the weight of truths that could no longer be hidden. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the palace courtyard in warm light, yet Evelyn felt as though she had walked through an entire lifetime since the night of the banquet. She stood alone beneath an ancient oak tree overlooking the royal gardens, breathing in the cool mountain air for what felt like the first time in days. Footsteps approached across the stone path, steady and familiar. She turned before hearing a voice, already knowing who it was. Lucien stopped beside the fountain several feet away, once again honoring the respectful distance he had never crossed. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer carried fear. It carried understanding. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the rippling water. "There is one question I still cannot answer," she admitted quietly. "Why did you trust me that night when everyone else was prepared to believe the worst?" Lucien watched the fountain for several long moments before speaking. "I did not trust circumstances. I trusted what they revealed." She looked at him, waiting. His expression softened as though he were remembering every moment with perfect clarity. "When I entered my chamber, you were unconscious. You were not frightened because you could not even open your eyes. You could not defend yourself. You could not explain anything. At that moment, you were completely dependent upon the choices of someone else." His calm voice never rose, but every word settled deeply within her heart. Power exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If I had ignored that responsibility, I would have betrayed the throne long before I betrayed you. Evelyn felt tears gathering despite her effort to remain composed. Lucien continued gently. "Many rulers believe respect comes from fear. I have never believed that. A person's dignity does not disappear simply because they are vulnerable." He glanced toward the palace windows where sunlight reflected like liquid gold. "Someone arranged that room hoping I would become part of their plan. Refusing to cross that boundary was the only choice that still belonged to me." Evelyn slowly realized that the greatest decision of that night had not been made by those who created the trap. It had been made by the man who quietly refused to let another person's life become a tool. She smiled through tear-filled eyes. "No one has ever explained kindness that way before." Lucien returned a faint smile of his own. "Because kindness is often mistaken for weakness. They are rarely the same thing." A gentle breeze stirred the flowering branches overhead, scattering white blossoms across the stone path between them. Evelyn watched the petals drift through the sunlight until one landed near her feet. For years she had believed silence was the price of peace. Now she understood that true peace began where fear finally ended. Lucien reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a small silver pendant attached to a delicate chain. "One of the palace servants found this beside your chair after the banquet," he said. "I thought it should be returned to its rightful owner." Evelyn accepted it carefully. It had belonged to her mother. She closed her fingers around the familiar keepsake, overwhelmed by gratitude that reached far beyond the necklace itself. As she looked back toward Lucien, she realized she was no longer seeing only a king whose reputation had frightened an entire kingdom. She was seeing a man whose quiet principles had restored something she thought she had lost forever. For the first time since that unforgettable night, hope no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt possible. 3 days later, the palace felt different. The whispers had not disappeared, but they had changed. Where suspicion had once followed Evelyn through every hallway, respectful greetings now quietly took its place. Servants smiled when she passed. Royal advisors nodded with genuine courtesy. Even those who had doubted her lowered their eyes with quiet regret. Truth had done what fear never could. It had restored dignity without demanding revenge. The first snowfall of the season arrived before sunrise, covering the palace gardens in a blanket of white that shimmered beneath the early morning light. Evelyn stood beside the eastern balcony wrapped in a soft wool cloak, watching delicate snowflakes drift across the silent courtyard. Everything looked untouched, as though the kingdom itself had been given the chance to begin again. She heard familiar footsteps behind her and smiled before turning around. Lucien approached carrying 2 warm cups of tea. He offered one to her with the same quiet respect that had guided every conversation they had shared. "The gardeners say the roses will bloom again in spring," he said. Evelyn accepted the cup, warming her hands against the porcelain. "They survived the winter." Lucien nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes surviving is the first victory." They stood together overlooking the peaceful valley beyond the palace walls. Neither hurried to fill the silence. For the first time since they had met, there was no investigation waiting, no rumors spreading through hidden corridors, no carefully planned deception hanging over the future. Only honesty remained. After several moments, Lucien reached into his coat and removed a small velvet box. Evelyn's heart skipped, but when he opened it, there was no ceremonial marking, no royal decree, and no symbol demanding an immediate answer. Inside rested a simple silver ring engraved with the image of an oak tree surrounded by small stars. "This belonged to my mother," Lucien said quietly. "She believed promises should never become chains." Evelyn looked up at him with gentle surprise. He closed the box again before placing it in her hands. "I am not asking you to accept anything today." His steady silver eyes met hers without expectation. "The kingdom has already tried to decide your future once. I will not make the same mistake." Emotion caught in Evelyn's throat. She had expected gratitude. She had expected friendship. She had never expected freedom. Lucien extended his hand toward her, not as a king issuing a command, but as one person inviting another to walk beside him. "If one day," he said softly, "your heart chooses this path without fear, without pressure, and without obligation, then come to me. Until that day, your choice belongs only to you." Evelyn looked at the offered hand for a long moment before lifting her own. She did not place it inside his immediately. Instead, she smiled through quiet tears, realizing that the greatest gift anyone had ever given her was not a title, a palace, or even protection. It was the right to decide her own future. Then, with complete certainty and without anyone else's voice guiding her, she placed her hand in his. The winter wind carried fresh snow across the palace gardens as the morning sun broke through the clouds, covering the white landscape with golden light. Far below, the kingdom awakened to another ordinary day, never realizing that its greatest story had not begun with power, destiny, or royal tradition. It had begun with one simple decision. When given every opportunity to take away another person's choice, someone instead chose to protect it. And from that single act of quiet honor, a future worthy of both a king and a queen finally began. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.